construction and in public sector who are leveraging standard documents now quite comfortably. And really it's about time we got in on that act and realised some of the benefits other organisations and industries have been enjoying. So I'm joined here, very happy to be joined by Chris Bates and Philip Allery, and we're going to be talking you through some of the rationale behind what sort of drove us to do what we're doing.
Right, so could we start with a quick straw poll? How many here of you are involved in contracting for services at the sharp end? Right, okay. Oh.
Good numbers.
Good numbers, yeah.
Yep.
And can you just shout out one or two sort of, real pinch points that you find in, dealing with the contract itself? Be it the lawyers, be it the process, but particularly the contract. Sorry, the lawyers, right, okay. Blame the lawyers. That's
cheap, sorry.
We're value.
And is there a roving mic for anyone? Has anyone got any contributions they want to share or experiences they want to share specifically? Please. Thank you.
Yeah, the downstream part is the legal aspects, but upstream is basically getting clients to decide what they want. As a segue from what the experts earlier this morning were saying, what do you need? Are you clear about what you want to achieve? We are sourcing advisors, so usually we find ourselves trying to help the client, kind of at least arrive at a working configuration of components of their solution. That's the part that we find the toughest. It's most grueling for us. The legal part, yes, there is a lot of back and forth, but it is something that can be done with, provided the intent is there on both sides to arrive at a quick agreement, if you like. So that's been my experience.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you.
Okay, so as we've heard, contracting in engineering and construction has for years had these standard forms, but we've not really tended to have them in the service sector. So what we're trying to do is to produce a sort of standard contract which should be able to be used by commercial managers and procurement people broadly without lawyers, dare I say. Because we are talking about a set of terms for, BAU standard commodity type purchasing. To the best of my knowledge, there isn't anything else really in the market. The CIPS, the Chartered Institute of Purchasing Suppliers, do have forms, but they tend to be a bit buyer-centric, and that's broadly speaking why there is no generally accepted standard form for services.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we as a collective have sort of reflected on in bringing about these standard terms is really the amount of time and energy that we seem to be expending over and over again on concepts that really don't need to have as much time and attention as they have. I think it was actually at one of the previous GSA conferences someone stood up and said, and it really stayed with me, that as lawyers we spend a disproportionate amount of our time advising our clients on the bits of the contract that regulate what happens when it all goes wrong. We don't spend nearly enough time focusing on the bits of what you actually are trying to achieve. What are you trying to build? How should it work? And that really is the bit that the real attention and focus should be upon. What the real advantage of the sort of the JCTs and the NECs of this world is that you do away with a huge amount of back and forth on stuff that really should be in a settled position. There are numerous ways you could draft a change procedure. There are numerous ways you could draft a force majeure clause. Do you really need to spend that much time looking at them, though? Those are the sorts of things that if you had trust and confidence in the document that you're using, because it's been used across the industry and it's used over and over again, that it's the standard approach to it and it's a fair and balanced approach, that would be, our vision here is that will facilitate a freeing up of time, resources and money to really focus on the stuff that will achieve something out of the relationship that you're looking to build.
And I think that's right, just picking the point the gentleman made at the front there. It frees up the capacity of lawyers and other people to focus on some of those pain points you talked about, rather than getting buried in liability caps and ands versus ors and all the other things that lawyers love. And I can say that because I'm a reform lawyer. So I think it's really good to get people kind of focusing on what exactly is being bought, how's it being delivered, and what's the price? Because that's the thing business people really care about, right? The rest of it is if something goes wrong, as Chris said, which we should be drafting to avoid, not drafting in the eventuality of, because it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, Philip, do you think, with that in mind, probably a bit of a leading question given that introduction, do you think we're using lawyers presently in an efficient way?
No, mainly for the reasons that have already been mentioned. We are spending too much time on things that really do not need to be redone. I don't know what else to say, really. I mean, I'm 67. I can remember the days before, believe it or not, guys, we had word processing. And that's going back a long time. Contracts have got longer and longer and longer. And to the best of my knowledge, there's no evidence that has made them better. So we are trying to make the language a lot simpler, so that people do not need to use lawyers necessarily to interpret some of this stuff. There's a lot of work has been done by you to try and simplify the language and take away some of the the legalese. Again, that should help the process as well.
I mean, to just jump in on that, obviously, at the risk of being a turkey voting for Christmas here, I mean, the need for lawyers will remain, and what we're trying to do is not supplant that completely, because I think we need to appreciate that there are different levels of complexity in the different procurement activities that we do. What we're trying to do, I think, is to deal with those things which are capable of being standardized, because you know what, to the point that was made earlier, if you're buying 100 widgets today and 100 widgets tomorrow, let's not waste time and effort and resources reinventing the wheel every time. But that is not to say that there is not a need for strategic advice. To the point about are we using lawyers correctly, I think transactions are getting all the more complicated because technology is becoming more complex, and the opportunities that are available to you are becoming, far less limited. And so, really, the place where lawyers should be helping you and advising you is very much more on how you structure your transactions and where you need to be looking at focusing on the risk, rather than spending time bogged down on the ands versus ors or the drafting nuances. And I think a lot of that can be done away with, particularly if you consider a standard RFP process. If you had a standardized contract, Edward already said earlier in the talk that you immediately do away with 60 or 70 pages of unnecessary review if you're working off a document that everyone's familiar with. Whereas that lack of familiarity, that lack of trust, and that lack of understanding of what the sort of specific drivers are for a given procuring entity, effectively creates a need to spend a lot of time up front in an RFP process reviewing and analysing the terms that could be time better spent elsewhere.
Yeah,
I think I saw a lady there with a hand.
Yeah, there's a question over there.
Hello, my name is Monica Brady. I'm from. Can you hear me?
Just, I think a mic's on its way to you.
Thank you. Hi, Monica Trivedi from Indigo Pre-Media in Bombay. We have a creative outsourcing offering, and so the issue is when you've got the word creative in there. So we work with agencies or pseudo-agencies. They send their creative out to us for execution work. Now, the problem I've had, and this has made me very happy that there's standard terms and conditions, we thankfully have a lot of trust with our clients, so we don't have those contracts. Every time I've tried to get a contract drafted, the lawyers actually don't understand what we do. and therefore they focus on the IP aspect. You know, it's like, it's not about the IP, it's about the process and about, you know, security of data or security of designs, and, you know, nothing should leak. So this has made me really happy that you're making these standard terms and conditions, but I think the lawyers also need to make maybe a bit more effort to understand what the offering is, so that's where I felt it's fallen apart in the past.
I think that's a really good point. I mean, much like any professional service and any consultancy, if you like, you think about the Big Four and the amount of time and effort they spend getting to know the business that they're working with. I agree with you that there is a gap there that lawyers could do better at filling. There are prevailing pressures on time and money for all parties concerned, and unfortunately the way the legal business model is set up, it's not one that naturally lends itself to, I tell you what, I'll spend a day at your business, really getting under the skin of it. But I think that is definitely a really good point, and if we were to reimagine the way we utilise legal spend, so that we're not focusing on as much, you know, the sort of the bog standard here and there terms, and we're focusing more on understanding the strategic priorities of the clients and understanding how the business model works that we're advising on in terms of, you know, the sort of the risk capacity, I think we can really actually start to do something much more special there.
And I think it's about acting as well in the best interests of our clients as lawyers. I think that there is certainly an argument to be made that charging a lot of money to effectively produce your firm template with a few things changed is good value for clients, when actually leveraging an industry standard document and really, to your point, understanding the specific services so you can populate the service schedule and spend time there. That's probably a better value add, I think, for clients. So I think that's part of it as well. It's getting that sort of best interest for clients. And Philip, one further question for you is, do you think we're being fair to smaller suppliers with the way things are currently, devoid of a set of standard T's and C's? Do you think it's a fair process, RFPs, etc., how it's run presently for smaller suppliers?
Well, by and large, no. No surprises there, I guess. I do in-house sort of consulting for, you know, through a law firm, and work in-house for various companies, and you know, a lot of companies, bigger companies, do have this rather model of, you know, absolute steamroller smaller businesses, and it's not just liability, it's in all sorts of areas, but the general approach is, if something goes wrong, you smaller supplier will pay, and pay very dearly. And it's actually, you know, I've actually seen cases, and seeing more and more of them, because people are not prepared to take some of the risks that the, you know, larger customers tend to impose. And that's actually, you know, that's not good for the smaller business, and it's actually not good for the bigger purchaser, because they're losing what smaller businesses often bring, which is some, you know, really positive new type thinking. Not too long ago, and I think this is a good example, I worked for a certain, you know, retailer, a very large retailer, and they actually had approached this on a very different basis, and they actually spent a lot of time and money producing, you know, dare I say, kind of what we're doing, you know, some standard terms and conditions, but they were fair. That was the key thing. They had very fair approaches on liability. It didn't have the word indemnity all over the place. And whilst, yes, you would get some bigger suppliers not prepared to go down that route, having really worked hard at it, they were getting, you know, a lot of business done. And the key thing being in retail, fast-moving consumer goods, is it? Yeah. You know, they need that stuff. They need these services, IT, whatever it was that that we're doing. And it was paying dividends, and it's a model I've tried to sell to some other people. But no, the smaller supplier is not. I wouldn't say ill-treated, but they certainly don't feel very well treated, in my experience. And so, yeah.
And I think it's even a step back from that as well, Philip. It's the contracts themselves are usually a risk profile that the larger suppliers with deeper pockets and bigger insurance policies can stand up to. But also, usually the RFP process is, here's an RFP, here's a 70-page pro-customer document and a statement of compliance, can you please fill that in? And the opportunity cost associated with bidding for that work for the small suppliers is quite often prohibitive, because the options are, I'll pay a law firm to review this 70-page document and get a 10 grand quote against a sort of 10% win probability, or I take a punt and sign it and hope that nothing goes wrong. And neither of those outcomes, I think, is a good one for the industry. As to your point, Philip, it means that what could have been an interesting opportunity and an interesting potential supplier for that customer falls off the grid, and you're left with the usual companies bidding for it.
Part of the problem there, though, of course, is the sort of kitchen sink mindset within the RFP document in the first place, because you don't need a document that covers absolutely all bases, everything, everywhere, and ties down the supplier to the nth degree in terms of the risk that you're requiring them to take. A sensible contract, because everyone knows you go into the RFP process, and then even with the suppliers who have the deeper pockets and the better opportunity to negotiate those things, you get to a point where it's preferred supplier. It's never about the legals. The legals are not going to determine whether or not the supplier wins the job. It's about the commercial proposition and the quality of the service. The legals are there essentially to regulate the relationship, but they should be an enabler, not something that is holding the document, holding the process up. And the point I'm making about the larger suppliers, once you get to that preferred bidder point, 9 times out of 10 you'll find that there are points that need to be reopened in the contract with it, and eventually you sort of negotiate back to a more sensible middle ground, coming back from the sort of kitchen sink document. So it's perhaps aspirational to say, why don't we start a bit closer to centre, and focus our energy and effort on doing other things that are more value additive. But that's certainly the aspiration that we're working on.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if anyone else had any reflections or observations they'd like to share. Please, Chris.
I was just thinking that maybe there'll be people here today who are thinking that sounds like a really good idea to adopt some standard terms, and I'm sure that you guys have given this some thought. What are those reasons why people wouldn't adopt these standard terms, and what could people do to mitigate those risks? What would you suggest they do to encourage their organisations to adopt standard terms?
Yeah, I'll have a first stab at this, and then please weigh in. So I think a lot of it is people don't like change, and so people have got very comfortable with their own in-house set of documents and templates, and they are very, very reluctant to move away from them. I think the key selling point, and I think the success of this project, will depend upon people really understanding that actually there's a high degree of configurability and flexibility within the documents we're creating. We're not trying to deny commercial flexibility. I think that's the mistake I think a lot of projects have made before, is they try and lock down things that shouldn't be locked down. I think the model we've kind of approached when drafting is, let's solve for the 70%, and then if there needs to be a flex around that 70%, let's enable it through special conditions, for example. Like you do when you purchase a house. Anyone who's purchased a house here, it's a standard document with special conditions. We all make the biggest purchase of our lives using a standard document. We get comfortable with it, and I think people have done one of two things. They've either made it too light, so it's not really worth value, or they've made it too prescriptive, which means it's just difficult to work with.
I think the other thing to think about here is the fact that there are a number of different